George W. Bush, served as the 43rd President of the United States. His presidency lasted from January 20th, 2001 to January 20th, 2009. He was a member of the Republican Party and the son of former President George A.W. Bush. Before his presidency, he was the governor of Texas. Bush's presidency was marked by significant events. These included the September 11th terrorist attacks and the subsequent war on terror. His time in office also saw economic challenges and natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina. His policies and actions have led to ongoing debates about his legacy. Bush was known for his straightforward communication style. This often endeared him to supporters, but also led to criticisms. His decisions had lasting impacts on both domestic and foreign policies. Understanding Bush's presidency requires looking at his policies, significant events, and public perception. This essay will explore these aspects in detail. We will also examine his legacy and its impact on the US and the world. George W. Bush was born on July 6, 1946 in New Haven, Connecticut. His family had a strong political background. His father, George H.W. Bush, served as the 41st President of the United States. Bush attended Yale University and later earned an MBA from Harvard Business School. Before entering politics, Bush worked in the oil industry. He also co-owned the Texas Rangers baseball team. His first major political role was as the governor of Texas. He served as governor from 1995 to 2000. During his tenure, he focused on education reform and tax cuts. Bush's governorship laid the foundation for his presidential run. He positioned himself as a compassionate conservative. This approach combined traditional conservative values with a focus on social issues. His campaign emphasized education, tax relief, and strong national defense. Bush's political career was also influenced by his family's legacy. His father's presidency and his brother Jeb's role as governor of Florida were significant factors. These connections helped him gain support within the Republican Party. Bush's domestic policies focused on tax cuts, education, and healthcare. One of his first major acts was the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001. This law aimed to provide significant tax cuts to stimulate the economy. He believed that reducing taxes would encourage investment and job creation. Education was another key area of focus for Bush. He introduced the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. This law aimed to improve educational standards and accountability. It required states to develop assessments in basic skills. Schools that failed to meet standards faced consequences. Healthcare reform was also part of Bush's domestic agenda. He signed the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act in 2003. This law added a prescription drug benefit to Medicare. It aimed to make medications more affordable for seniors. Bush's domestic policies received mixed reviews. Supporters praised his tax cuts and education reforms. Critics argued that his policies favored the wealthy and increased the national deficit. His approach to healthcare faced criticism for benefiting pharmaceutical companies. The US economy faced significant challenges during Bush's presidency. The early 2000s saw a recession and the bursting of the dot-com bubble. Bush's response included tax cuts aimed at stimulating economic growth. The Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003 was a key measure. It reduced tax rates on dividends and capital gains. Bush also focused on deregulation as a means to stimulate the economy. He believed that reducing government interference would encourage business growth. However, critics argued that deregulation contributed to the financial crisis of 2008. The lack of oversight in the financial sector was seen as a factor in the crisis. The housing market crisis was another major economic issue. Rising home prices and risky lending practices led to a housing bubble. When the bubble burst, it resulted in widespread foreclosures and financial instability. The Bush administration's response included the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. This program aimed to stabilize the financial system by purchasing distressed assets. Bush's economic measures had varied impacts. While some praised his tax cuts for boosting the economy, others criticized the long-term effect. The financial crisis of 2008 left a lasting mark on his economic legacy. The recession that followed was one of the worst in US history. The US economy faced significant challenges during Bush's presidency. The early 2000s saw a recession and the bursting of the dot-com bubble. Bush's response included tax cuts aimed at stimulating economic growth. The Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003 was a key measure. Critics argued deregulation contributed to the financial crisis of 2008. The Bush administration's response included the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. The financial crisis of 2008 left a lasting mark on his economic legacy. Section 5. Education reforms. Education was a central focus of Bush's domestic policy. The No Child Left Behind Act, or NCLB, was one of his key initiatives. Signed into law in 2002, NCLB aimed to improve educational outcomes. The law required states to set academic standards and conduct annual assessments. Schools that failed to meet standards faced penalties. NCLB emphasized accountability and aimed to close achievement gaps. It focused on reading and math skills with a goal of making all students proficient by 2014. The law also aimed to increase parental choice by allowing transfers from failing schools. Despite its goals, NCLB faced significant criticism. Critics argued that it placed too much emphasis on standardized testing. They also claimed that it led to a narrow focus on reading and math at the expense of other subjects. Some educators felt that the penalties for failing schools were too harsh. Supporters of NCLB praised its emphasis on accountability and data-driven decision-making. They argued that the law helped highlight disparities in education and pushed for improvements. The debate over NCLB's impact continues, reflecting the complexities of education reform. Section 6. Foreign policies. Bush's foreign policies were dominated by the War on Terror. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks were a defining moment. In response, Bush launched the War on Terror, aiming to combat global terrorism. This included military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The invasion of Afghanistan began in October 2001. The goal was to dismantle the Taliban regime and eliminate al-Qaeda. Operation Enduring Freedom saw initial successes, but the conflict became prolonged. Efforts to stabilize Afghanistan faced ongoing challenges. In 2003, Bush launched the Iraq War. The stated goal was to eliminate weapons of mass destruction and promote democracy. The invasion led to the toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime. However, the failure to find WMDs and the subsequent insurgency raised questions about the war's justification. Bush's foreign policies also included strengthening alliances and promoting democracy. He emphasized the importance of international cooperation in combating terrorism. His administration worked to build coalitions and support democratic movements in various regions. Section 7. War on Terror. The War on Terror was a central focus of Bush's presidency. The September 11 attacks prompted a swift response. Bush declared a global war against terrorism, targeting groups like al-Qaeda. The invasion of Afghanistan was the first major military action. Efforts to stabilize the country faced ongoing challenges and resistance. In 2003, Bush expanded the War on Terror to Iraq. The invasion led to the toppling of Saddam Hussein but failed to find WMDs. The use of enhanced interrogation techniques and Guantanamo Bay sparked debates on human rights. Section 8. Iraq War. The Iraq War was one of the most controversial aspects of Bush's presidency. Launched in 2003, the war aimed to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. The initial invasion saw the rapid toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime. However, no WMDs were found, raising questions about the war's justification. The aftermath saw a rise in insurgency and sectarian violence. The power vacuum contributed to instability. Efforts to rebuild faced significant challenges. The war led to prolonged military presence and significant casualties. Bush's administration faced criticism for its handling of the war. Critics argued that the intelligence used to justify the invasion was flawed. The lack of a clear post-war plan also drew criticism. The war's human and financial costs were significant. Supporters argued it removed a brutal dictator and promoted democracy. They emphasized addressing global security threats. The debate over the Iraq War's legacy continues. Section 9. Significant events. Bush's presidency was marked by several significant events. The September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks were a defining moment. These attacks led to the war on terror and reshaped US foreign policy. The response included military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Another major event was Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The hurricane caused widespread devastation along the Gulf Coast. The government's response faced criticism for being slow and inadequate. The disaster highlighted issues in disaster preparedness and response. The financial crisis of 2008 was another key event. The collapse of major financial institutions led to a severe economic downturn. The Bush administration's response included the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. This program aimed to stabilize the financial system by purchasing distressed assets. These events had lasting impacts on Bush's presidency and legacy. They shaped public perception and influenced policy decisions. The responses to these events continue to be analyzed and debated. Understanding these events is crucial to evaluating Bush's time in office. Section 10. Public perception. Public perception of Bush's presidency varied over time. During his early years, he enjoyed high approval ratings. The response to the September 11 attacks was seen as strong and decisive. However, the prolonged conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq led to declining support. The handling of Hurricane Katrina significantly impacted public perception. The government's slow response drew widespread criticism. The disaster highlighted issues in leadership and preparedness. This event contributed to a decline in Bush's approval ratings. The financial crisis of 2008 further affected public perception. The collapse of major financial institutions led to economic instability. The Bush administration's response faced criticism for its handling of the crisis. The recession that followed had significant impacts on the economy and public opinion. Bush's legacy remains a subject of debate. Supporters highlight his leadership during challenging times and his efforts to combat terrorism. Critics focus on the controversies and long-term impacts of his policies. The complexity of his presidency makes it a topic of ongoing analysis. Section 11. Conclusion. George W. Bush's presidency was marked by significant events and policies. His domestic policies focused on tax cuts, education reform, and healthcare. The war on terror and the Iraq War were central aspects of his foreign policy. Major events like 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, and the financial crisis shaped his time in office. Bush's legacy is complex and multifaceted. His leadership during the September 11 attacks and efforts to combat terrorism are notable. However, controversies like the Iraq War and the handling of Hurricane Katrina have left lasting impacts. Public perception of his presidency has varied, reflecting the challenges and decisions he faced. Understanding Bush's presidency requires examining his policies, significant events, and public perception. His time in office had lasting impacts on the US and the world. The debates over his legacy continue, highlighting the complexities of his presidency.